I think I didn't do anything wrong, just made a joke that everyone laughed at. But by the next morning, I found divorce papers on the kitchen table and my husband was gone. Now, everyone keeps asking why he left, but I still don't see what the big deal was. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The living room buzzed with conversation and laughter as our anniversary party reached its peak. 23 friends and family members filled our suburban home, celebrating 15 years of marriage between Graham and me. I stood near the fireplace, wine glass in hand, feeling particularly witty after my third glass of Chardonnay. "Lenora, you look absolutely radiant tonight," my mother Harriet gushed, her voice carrying that familiar tone of approval she reserved for moments when I commanded attention. "Graham is so lucky to have you." I smiled, glancing across the room where my husband stood quietly by the kitchen doorway, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the evening's hosting duties. At 37, Graham had grown more reserved over the years, content to let me take center stage at social gatherings. His software engineering job had made him comfortable with solitude, but tonight felt different. He seemed almost distant. "Oh, I don't know about lucky," I laughed, loud enough for several nearby conversations to pause. "I mean, Graham's sweet and all, but let's be honest, husbands are pretty replaceable these days, aren't they?" The room fell into an uncomfortable silence for a moment before nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. My sister Mallory, 2 years younger and always eager to support my boldest statements, giggled approvingly. "Lenora, you're terrible," she said, but her tone suggested she found my comment deliciously scandalous rather than inappropriate. I noticed Ethan Marrow, Graham's old college friend who'd recently started working at my office, shift uncomfortably near the dining table. His sandy hair caught the lamplight as he avoided eye contact with Graham. Ethan had become such a wonderful confidant over the past few months, someone who actually listened to my problems and understood my frustrations with Graham's emotional distance. "I'm just saying," I continued, emboldened by the attention. "If something happened to Graham tomorrow, I'd probably have a line of better candidates by the weekend. Right, Ethan? You'd help me interview replacements, wouldn't you?" Ethan's face flushed red. "Lenora, maybe we should—" "Oh, come on," I interrupted, waving my wine glass dramatically. "Everyone knows I'm the catch in this relationship. Graham got lucky when he landed me, not the other way around." More uncomfortable laughter followed, but I noticed Graham's parents, Irene and Peter, exchanging worried glances near the sofa. 63-year-old Irene had never been my biggest fan, though she'd always maintained polite civility for Graham's sake. Tonight, however, her expression had hardened into something approaching disgust. Graham himself remained motionless by the kitchen doorway, his face unreadable. Our 8-year-old daughter, Chloe, had been playing with her cousins earlier, but I noticed she'd disappeared upstairs sometime during my impromptu comedy routine. "Graham's replaceable, but his mother isn't," I added with a theatrical sigh. "Though honestly, Irene, if you could find me a son-in-law with a little more excitement, I'd be grateful." This time, the silence stretched longer. Peter cleared his throat and moved toward his wife, whose face had gone pale with anger. "Lenora," Graham's voice cut through the tension, quiet but firm. "Could I speak with you in the kitchen?" "Oh, lighten up, honey," I called back, not moving from my spot by the fireplace. "Everyone knows I'm just joking. You're stuck with me whether you like it or not." But Graham had already turned and walked away. I heard the back door open and close, followed by the sound of his car starting in the driveway. The party continued for another hour, though the energy never quite recovered. My mother and Mallory stayed close, reassuring me that Graham was being overly sensitive as usual, but I couldn't shake the image of Irene's cold stare as she and Peter gathered their coats and left without saying goodbye. When the last guest departed around midnight, I found myself alone in the living room, surrounded by empty wine glasses and crumpled napkins. Graham still hadn't returned home. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my slight hangover as I drove to my job as an office administrator at Hartwell and Associates. Graham's side of the bed had remained empty all night, and I'd found only a brief text message on my phone. "Staying at Dad's tonight. We'll talk tomorrow." Typical Graham, dramatic and moody over nothing. My office occupied a corner of the second floor, with windows overlooking the parking lot where I could see employees arriving for another mundane Monday. I'd been working at Hartwell for 6 years, handling scheduling and correspondence for the partners, but lately the job felt increasingly tedious. The only bright spot had been Ethan's arrival 3 months ago as a consultant for their new digital infrastructure project. Around 10:30, I heard his familiar knock on my doorframe. "Morning, Lenora," Ethan said, but his usual warm smile seemed strained. "How are you feeling after last night?" Like I need about 3 cups of coffee, I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. Graham's being his usual dramatic self, of course. He didn't even come home. Ethan sat down slowly, running his hand through his sandy hair, a nervous habit I'd grown to recognize over our many coffee breaks and lunch conversations. Lenora, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me, he said. Do you think maybe you went a little too far last night? I stared at him, genuinely surprised. Too far? Ethan, it was a joke. Everyone laughed. Not everyone, he said quietly. Graham looked pretty hurt, and his parents seemed upset. His parents have never liked me, I said, dismissing his concern with a wave. Irene thinks Graham married beneath him, and Peter just goes along with whatever she says. As for Graham, he's always been too sensitive. You know that. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I know you've been having problems with him, but calling him replaceable in front of all your friends and family, that was pretty harsh, don't you think? It was a joke, I repeated, feeling my irritation rising. God, you men are all so fragile. I thought you understood me better than that, Ethan. For the past few months, Ethan had been the one person who truly listened to my complaints about Graham's emotional unavailability, his boring predictability, his lack of ambition. During our long lunch conversations at the bistro down the street, Ethan had validated my feelings in ways Graham never did. He understood that I needed intellectual stimulation, emotional connection, someone who appreciated my wit and intelligence. I do understand you, Ethan said carefully, but maybe there are better ways to handle your marriage problems than humiliating Graham publicly. Humiliating him? I laughed, but it sounded forced even to my own ears. Ethan, you're being as dramatic as he is. It was one comment at a party. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Mallory. Mom and I were talking this morning. We think Graham is being ridiculous. You deserve better than his sulking. Call me later. I showed Ethan the message. See? At least some people have perspective. Ethan read the text but didn't respond immediately. Finally, he stood up and moved toward the door. I should get back to work, he said. But Lenora, maybe you should consider apologizing to Graham. Even if you meant it as a joke, it clearly hurt him. After he left, I tried to focus on my administrative tasks, but my mind kept wandering. Around lunchtime, my phone rang with a call from Irene. Lenora, we need to talk, Graham's mother said without preamble. What you did last night was unacceptable. Hello to you too, Irene, I replied coolly. I assume you're calling about Graham's little tantrum? Little tantrum? Her voice rose in pitch. You publicly humiliated my son in front of his friends and family. You called him replaceable and suggested another man could do better. How is that a little tantrum? It was a joke, Irene. Maybe if Graham had a sense of humor, he would have understood that. A joke? Irene's voice turned ice cold. Lenora, I've watched you disrespect my son for years, but last night crossed every line. And don't think I haven't noticed how close you've gotten to that Ethan fellow. My stomach clenched, but I forced my voice to remain steady. I don't know what you're implying, but Ethan is just a friend and colleague. Is he? Irene asked. Because from where I was standing last night, it looked like you were flirting with him right in front of your husband. You're being ridiculous, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if others had noticed the same thing. The call ended badly, with Irene warning me that Graham wouldn't tolerate much more of my behavior. I spent the rest of the afternoon stewing over her accusations and trying to craft the perfect response to Graham's inevitable confrontation. At 5:15, another text arrived from Graham. We need to talk. I'll be home late, around 9. Please be there. I rolled my eyes, but felt a small knot of worry forming in my stomach. Graham arrived home at exactly 9 o'clock, his punctuality as predictable as everything else about him. I'd spent the evening rehearsing my defense, determined to make him see reason about his overreaction to a harmless joke. He found me in the living room, still wearing his work clothes, but looking more tired than I'd seen him in months. His usually neat appearance seemed disheveled, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd slept as poorly as I had. Where's Chloe? He asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Upstairs doing homework, I replied. Graham, before you say anything, I want you to know that I think you're being completely unreasonable about last night. He sat down in the armchair across from me, maintaining careful distance. Unreasonable? Yes, unreasonable, I said, leaning forward. It was a joke, Graham. Everyone laughed. You're acting like I committed some terrible crime. Everyone laughed, he repeated slowly. Did you see my parents' faces? Did you notice that Chloe disappeared upstairs right after you called me replaceable? Your parents have never liked me, and Chloe is 8 years old. She doesn't understand adult humor. Graham stared at me for a long moment. Lenora, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Are you having an affair with Ethan Marrow? The question hit me like a physical blow. What? Graham, how could you even ask that? Because you've been spending an awful lot of time with him lately. Long lunches, late phone calls, and last night you practically threw yourself at him in front of everyone. I did not throw myself at him, I protested. Ethan is a friend and colleague. We work together, Graham. Of course we spend time together. Work lunches that last 2 hours? Graham's voice remained calm, but I could hear the steel underneath. Phone calls at 10 o'clock at night? Text messages on weekends? My heart raced. How did he know about the phone calls and texts? You've been spying on me, I asked, trying to shift the focus back to his behavior. I've been paying attention to my wife, he replied. Something I should have done months ago. Graham, you're being paranoid. Ethan and I are friends, that's all. Friends, he said. Is that why you told him last week that you were thinking about leaving me? The blood drained from my face. I had mentioned that to Ethan during one of our lunch conversations, but only because he'd been so understanding about my marital frustrations. How do you know about that? I whispered. Because Ethan told me, Graham said quietly. He came to see me this morning. He's concerned about you, Lenora. He thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. He what? My voice came out as a squeak. He told me about your conversations over the past few months, how you've been complaining about our marriage, talking about leaving, asking him if he thought you were attractive. He's worried that you're using him to avoid dealing with whatever's really bothering you. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Ethan had betrayed my confidence? After all those conversations where he'd seemed so understanding, so supportive? He's lying, I said desperately. Graham, Ethan is lying to you. Is he? Graham reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Because I have text messages here that suggest otherwise. My stomach turned to ice. What text messages? The ones you sent to your sister last week. Graham is being ridiculous again. Thank God I have Ethan to talk to. At least someone appreciates me. How did you get my texts to Mallory? You left your phone unlocked on the kitchen counter, Graham said. I wasn't snooping, Lenora. The message notification popped up while I was standing there. I tried to think of an explanation, but my mind had gone blank. Everything was spinning out of control. Graham, you're taking everything out of context, I said finally. Yes, I've been frustrated with our marriage. Yes, I've talked to Ethan about it, but that doesn't mean I'm having an affair. Maybe not a physical affair, Graham said, but you've been emotionally cheating on me for months, and last night you humiliated me in front of everyone we care about. I was joking. Were you? His voice grew harder. Because it didn't feel like a joke, Lenora. It felt like you were telling everyone exactly how you really feel about me. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted our argument. Chloe appeared in the doorway, wearing her pajamas and clutching her stuffed elephant. Daddy, she said in a small voice, are you and Mommy getting divorced? Graham's face immediately softened. Come here, sweetheart. Chloe ran to him, and he lifted her onto his lap. Why would you ask that, honey? Because you didn't come home last night, and now you're fighting again, she said, tears forming in her eyes. And at the party, Mommy said you were replaceable. What does that mean? I watched Graham's jaw clench as he hugged our daughter closer. It means Mommy was making a joke that wasn't very funny, he said gently. Don't worry about grown-up problems, okay? Why don't you go back to bed, and I'll come tuck you in a few minutes. After Chloe left, Graham turned back to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, resolved, and utterly final. I'm done, Lenora, he said quietly. I'm done being disrespected. I'm done being taken for granted. And I'm done pretending this marriage is working. Graham, please, I said, panic rising in my chest. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. No, he said, standing up. We can't. Because you don't think you did anything wrong. Even now, you're trying to manipulate me into believing I'm overreacting. He walked toward the stairs, then paused and looked back at me. I'll be staying at my parents' house for a while. We'll figure out the custody arrangements for Chloe later. Custody arrangements? I stood up, my legs shaking. Graham, you can't be serious. But he was already climbing the stairs, leaving me alone in the living room with the devastating realization that my perfect life was falling apart. The following weekend, I arranged to meet several friends and family members at our usual spot, the local bistro where Ethan and I had shared so many lunches. I needed to control the narrative before Graham's version of events spread too far. My mother Harriet arrived first, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression radiating righteous indignation on my behalf. Mallory followed close behind, already armed with supportive talking points about my right to speak my mind in my own home. "Honestly, Lenora," Harriet said as she settled into her chair, "Graham is being absolutely ridiculous. Men these days have no sense of humor about anything." "That's what I keep telling her," Mallory agreed. "One little joke, and he's acting like she committed murder." I felt a surge of gratitude for their unwavering support, but it was dampened by the absence of several friends who'd declined my invitation. Worse, I'd tried calling Ethan 3 times since Graham's revelation about their conversation, but he hadn't returned any of my messages. Peter and Irene arrived together, their faces grim with purpose. Graham's father looked uncomfortable, as if he'd been dragged into a situation he'd rather avoid, but Irene's expression radiated barely contained fury. "Well," Irene said, as she sat down without removing her coat, "I suppose you've called us here to explain yourself." "I've called you here to clear the air," I replied, trying to maintain my composure. "Graham is blowing everything out of proportion, and I think it's important that everyone understands what really happened." "What really happened," Irene repeated, her voice dripping with disdain, "is that you humiliated my son in front of everyone who matters to him." "It was a joke, Irene. One joke." "Was it a joke when you flirted with Ethan Marrow all evening? Was it a joke when you suggested that other men would be lining up to replace Graham? Was it a joke when you made our granddaughter so uncomfortable that she hid in her room?" Mallory jumped to my defense. "Mrs. Vane, I think you're being unfair. Lenora has every right to express herself in her own home." "Express herself?" Irene turned her cold gaze to my sister. "Is that what you call publicly destroying your husband's dignity?" "Graham needs to develop a thicker skin," Harriet interjected. "Lenora is a vibrant, intelligent woman. She shouldn't have to walk on eggshells around his fragile ego." Peter finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Harriet, with all due respect, you weren't married to the man your daughter humiliated last weekend." "Humiliated is a strong word," I said, but even as I spoke, I could hear how defensive I sounded. "Is it?" Irene leaned forward. "Because I've been thinking about that night all week, Lenora. I've been thinking about the look on Graham's face when you called him replaceable. I've been thinking about how you flirted with another man right in front of him, and I've been thinking about how our granddaughter witnessed all of it." "You're exaggerating everything," I protested. "Am I? Because Graham showed us the text messages you've been sending to your sister, the ones where you complain about him constantly and praise Ethan Marrow for understanding you better than your own husband." My stomach dropped. Graham had shared my private texts with his parents? "Those were private conversations," I said weakly. "Private conversations where you emotionally cheated on my son?" Irene shot back. "Private conversations where you planned to leave him while stringing him along?" "I never said I was planning to leave him." "You told Ethan Marrow you were thinking about it," Peter said quietly, "and you asked him if he thought you were making the right choice." The conversation was spiraling out of control. How did they know so much about my private discussions with Ethan? "Where is Ethan, anyway?" Mallory asked, looking around the restaurant. "I thought he'd be here to support you." "He's busy," I said, not wanting to admit that he'd been avoiding my calls. Irene smiled coldly. "Busy distancing himself from this mess, I'd imagine. Smart man." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Irene said, standing up and reaching for her purse, "that Ethan Marrow told Graham everything. Every lunch conversation where you complained about your marriage. Every phone call where you flirted with him. Every time you asked him if he found you attractive." "He told Graham what?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Everything," Peter confirmed. "He came to Graham on Monday morning and confessed the whole thing. Said he was worried about you and felt guilty about encouraging your complaints." "Encouraging?" I whispered. "Apparently he realized that he'd been enabling your emotional affair," Irene continued. "He felt terrible about it and wanted to make things right with Graham." The room started spinning. Ethan had betrayed me completely, not just by telling Graham about our conversations, but by framing them as an emotional affair that he'd been reluctantly drawn into. That's not how it happened," I stammered. "Isn't it?" Irene asked. "Because according to Ethan, you've been pursuing him for months, asking him to lunch, calling him at night, texting him on weekends. He said he tried to keep things professional, but you kept pushing boundaries." "That's a lie." I stood up so quickly that my chair scraped against the floor. "Ethan was the one who encouraged me. He was the one who said I deserved better than Graham." "Really?" Irene's smile grew wider. "Because he has text messages that tell a very different story. Messages where you initiated every personal conversation. Messages where you asked him not to tell Graham about your lunch dates." I felt like I was drowning. Every word Ethan had spoken to me. Every sympathetic look, every moment of understanding. It had all been a lie. Or worse, he'd been documenting it all as evidence of my inappropriate behavior. "You're all ganging up on me," I said desperately. "This is exactly what Graham wants. Everyone turning against me." "Graham wants a divorce," Peter said quietly. "He's already contacted a lawyer." The words hit me like a physical blow. "A divorce? But we can work this out. We can go to counseling." "Can you?" Irene asked. "Because even now, sitting here with all the evidence laid out in front of you, you still don't think you did anything wrong." I made one joke at a party. "You emotionally cheated on your husband for months," Irene corrected. "You pursued another man while complaining about your marriage. You humiliated Graham publicly, and you've spent this entire week trying to convince everyone that he's overreacting." Mallory reached for my hand. "Lenora, maybe you should just apologize. Tell Graham you're sorry and that you'll do better." "Apologize for what?" I snapped, pulling my hand away. "For having a friend who actually listens to me? For making a joke at my own anniversary party?" "For breaking your marriage vows," Irene said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Harriet seemed at a loss for words. Finally, Peter stood up and helped his wife with her coat. "Lenora," he said sadly, "Graham is our son, and we love him. We can't support you in this." "And neither can I," came a voice from behind me. I turned to see Ethan standing near the restaurant entrance, his face pale but determined. He walked over to our table, ignoring my shocked expression. "Ethan," Mallory said brightly, "we were just talking about you." "I know," he said quietly. "Lenora, I came to tell you that I won't be returning your calls anymore. What happened between us was inappropriate, and I take full responsibility for my part in it." "Your part in it?" I stood up again, my voice rising. "Ethan, you encouraged everything. You told me I deserved better than Graham." "I was wrong," he said simply. "And I'm sorry. I should have encouraged you to work on your marriage instead of complaining about it." "You can't be serious," I said, but I could see in his eyes that he was completely serious. "I am. Graham is a good man, and he deserved better from both of us. I've already apologized to him, and now I'm apologizing to you. I'm sorry I enabled your behavior instead of being a real friend." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the restaurant with my world crashing down around me. 2 weeks later, I sat in the sterile waiting room of Brennan and Associates, the law firm Graham had hired to handle our divorce proceedings. The official papers had arrived by courier the previous Monday, along with a detailed list of evidence that made my stomach turn. My own lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres, whom Mallory had recommended, sat beside me reviewing the documents with growing concern. "Lenora," she said quietly, "I have to be honest with you. This is going to be difficult." "Difficult how?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Your husband's attorney has compiled a comprehensive case documenting emotional neglect, public humiliation, and what they're calling an emotional affair. They have text messages, phone records, witness statements, and even video evidence from your anniversary party." "Video evidence?" "Apparently someone recorded your comments about your husband being replaceable. The recording clearly shows his reaction and the reaction of other guests, including your daughter." I closed my eyes, remembering how many phones had been out that night, capturing what I'd thought were just party memories. "What does this mean for custody?" I asked. Rebecca's expression grew more serious. "They're requesting primary custody of Chloe, with supervised visitation for you initially." "Supervised visitation? Rebecca, I'm her mother." "I know, but they have documentation suggesting that your behavior has been emotionally damaging to your daughter. They have a diary entry where she wrote about being scared when you and Graham fight." My heart sank. Chloe kept a diary. They also have testimony from Graham's parents about Chloe's emotional state during and after the party. Apparently, she told her grandmother that she was embarrassed by your behavior. The conference room door opened, and Graham entered with his attorney, a distinguished man in his 50s named David Brennan. Graham looked different, more confident, more resolved than I'd seen him in years. He nodded politely but didn't make eye contact with me. "Let's get started," Brennan said, spreading documents across the conference table. "Mrs. Vane, my client is seeking a legal separation with the intention of filing for divorce in 6 months. He's prepared to be generous with the financial settlement, but he wants primary custody of your daughter." "Generous?" I found my voice. "This is my home, my family. I'm not going anywhere." "Actually," Brennan continued calmly, "the house is in both names, but my client has been making the mortgage payments for the past 15 years. He's willing to buy out your half at current market value." "And if I refuse?" "Then we'll let a judge decide," Brennan said. but I should warn you that we have substantial evidence of behavior that a family court judge would find concerning. He opened a folder and began laying out photographs, printed text messages, and official-looking documents. We have documentation of your emotional affair with Ethan Marrow, including phone records showing calls lasting up to 2 hours, often late at night. We have text messages where you discussed leaving your husband and asked Mr. Marrow if he found you attractive. Those conversations were taken out of context, I protested. Were they? Brennan pulled out another document. We have a sworn statement from Mr. Marrow himself, detailing how you pursued an inappropriate relationship with him while married to my client. Ethan is lying to save himself. Is he? Brennan showed me a printed email. This is a message you sent to Mr. Marrow 3 weeks ago, asking him to meet you at a hotel to talk privately about your future together. I stared at the email in shock. I had written that, but it wasn't what it looked like. I'd been desperate to talk to Ethan after Graham moved out, and the hotel lobby had seemed like a neutral place to meet. That's not what it sounds like, I said weakly. Mrs. Vane, Brennan continued, we also have the video recording from your anniversary party, where you publicly humiliated my client in front of your friends and family. The recording clearly shows your daughter's distress and your husband's humiliation. Rebecca leaned forward. Mr. Brennan, while my client's behavior may have been inappropriate, it hardly rises to the level of emotional abuse. Doesn't it? Brennan pulled out another folder. We have documentation showing a pattern of emotional manipulation and verbal abuse spanning several years. Text messages where Mrs. Vane calls her husband pathetic and boring. Voicemails where she threatens to leave him if he doesn't change. Testimony from friends and family about her pattern of publicly belittling him. Those are private marital disputes, Rebecca argued. Private disputes that affected their child, Brennan countered. We have Chloe's diary entries describing her fear during her parents' arguments. We have testimony from her teacher about changes in her behavior and academic performance over the past year. I felt like I was watching my life being dissected by strangers. Every private moment, every frustrated comment, every marital argument had been documented and weaponized against me. What do you want? I asked Graham directly. He looked at me for the first time since entering the room. I want a peaceful divorce, Lenora. I want primary custody of Chloe, and I want you to get the help you need. Help? Counseling, he said quietly. Individual therapy to figure out why you've been so angry and destructive. I'm not the one who needs therapy, I snapped. You're the one who can't take a joke. The silence that followed was deafening. Oh, even Rebecca looked uncomfortable. Finally, Brennan spoke. Mrs. Vane, I think this conversation demonstrates exactly why my client is seeking primary custody. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of your inappropriate behavior, you continue to minimize and deflect responsibility. I'm not deflecting anything, aren't you? Graham's voice was sad rather than angry. Lenora, you called me replaceable in front of our daughter. You emotionally cheated on me for months. You've spent weeks trying to convince everyone that I'm overreacting to a harmless joke. When do you take responsibility for your actions? I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me, Rebecca's professional concern, Brennan's cold efficiency, and Graham's quiet disappointment. They were all waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge what I'd done, to show some sign of remorse. But I couldn't, because deep down, I still believed that everyone was overreacting. I still believed that Graham was being too sensitive, that one joke at a party didn't justify destroying our marriage. I want to fight this, I told Rebecca. She sighed. Lenora, I have to advise you that fighting this will be expensive, time-consuming, and likely unsuccessful. The evidence against you is substantial. I don't care. I'm not giving up my daughter without a fight. Graham's face fell, and for a moment I saw a flash of the pain I'd caused him. Then we'll see you in court, Brennan said, gathering his documents. As they prepared to leave, Graham paused at the door. Lenora, he said quietly, it doesn't have to be this way. You could still apologize. You could still get help, for Chloe's sake, if not for your own. But I just stared at him, my pride and stubbornness winning out over any impulse toward reconciliation. He shook his head sadly and walked away, leaving me alone with Rebecca and the devastating realization that I was about to lose everything. 6 months later, I stood outside the family courthouse on a cold February morning, clutching the handle of my purse so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. The legal battle had been brutal, expensive, and exactly as one-sided as Rebecca had predicted. Inside the courthouse, Judge Patricia Williams reviewed the final custody arrangements, while Graham, his parents, and Chloe sat on one side of the courtroom. I sat on the other side with Mallory and my mother, the physical distance reflecting the emotional chasm that had opened between us and everyone else in our former shared life. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, Judge Williams announced, this court awards primary physical custody of Chloe Vane to her father, Graham Vane, with supervised visitation rights for the mother, Lenora Vane, pending completion of court-mandated counseling. The words hit me like a physical blow. Supervised visitation, court-mandated counseling. The judge was treating me like I was dangerous to my own daughter. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, the court finds that Mrs. Vane's pattern of emotional manipulation, public humiliation of her spouse, and inappropriate relationship with a third party created an unstable home environment detrimental to the child's well-being. I wanted to stand up and object, to tell the judge that she was wrong, that everyone was wrong, but Rebecca had warned me repeatedly to stay silent unless directly addressed. The court also notes Mrs. Vane's continued refusal to acknowledge the impact of her behavior on her family, which raises concerns about her ability to provide appropriate emotional support for her daughter. Across the aisle, I could see Chloe sitting between Graham and Irene, looking small and confused in her best dress. She'd grown taller over the past 6 months, and I realized with a pang how much of her life I'd already missed during this legal battle. Mr. Vane, Judge Williams addressed Graham, the court commends your patience and commitment to your daughter's well-being throughout these proceedings. You will have primary custody, with Mrs. Vane entitled to supervised visits every other weekend, pending her completion of individual therapy and parenting classes. Graham nodded solemnly. Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Vane, the judge turned to me, this court strongly encourages you to take advantage of the counseling resources available to you. Your daughter needs both parents in her life, but only if you can provide a stable, supportive environment. Yes, Your Honor, I managed to whisper. As the proceedings concluded and people began filing out of the courtroom, I found myself frozen in place. Everything I'd fought for, everything I'd believed I deserved, had slipped away. The house would be sold, with Graham getting the majority of the proceeds. My savings had been depleted by legal fees. And most devastating of all, I would see my daughter only under supervision, as if I were some kind of threat to her safety. Graham approached me as I sat alone in the now empty courtroom. Lenora, he said quietly, I want you to know that this isn't about revenge. It's about what's best for Chloe. I looked up at him. This man I'd called replaceable, this husband I'd taken for granted for so many years. He looked older, wearier, but also somehow more at peace than I'd seen him in a long time. I know you think I'm the villain in all this, I said, my voice barely audible, but I never meant to hurt Chloe. I know, he said, but intent doesn't always matter as much as impact. Graham, I started to speak, but the words died in my throat. What could I say? That I was sorry? That I'd been wrong? Even now, sitting in the wreckage of my life, I couldn't quite bring myself to admit that everything had been my fault. The supervised visits don't have to be permanent, Graham said gently. If you get the help you need, if you can show that you understand what went wrong, we can revisit the custody arrangement. I nodded, not trusting my voice. But Lenora, he continued, you have to want to change. Not for me, not for the court, but for yourself and for Chloe. He walked away then, joining his parents and our daughter near the courthouse exit. I watched through the tall windows as they got into Peter's car and drove away, taking Chloe to the life they'd built without me. Mallory and my mother flanked me as we left the courthouse, both trying to offer comfort and reassurance, but their words felt hollow now, their earlier encouragement of my behavior seeming naive and destructive in hindsight. This isn't over, Mallory said as we reached the parking lot. You can appeal or work on getting the custody modified. Can I? I asked, genuinely uncertain. Of course you can, my mother insisted. Graham is being vindictive, and eventually everyone will see that. But even as she spoke, I could hear the doubt in her voice. The evidence had been overwhelming, the judge's decision swift and decisive. Everyone could see what I'd refused to acknowledge, that I'd destroyed my marriage through my own actions. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart jumped, thinking it might be from Graham or even Chloe. Instead, it was from Ethan. I heard about the custody decision. I'm sorry it worked out this way. Please don't contact me again. I stared at the message, remembering all those lunch conversations where he'd seemed so understanding, so supportive of my complaints about Graham. Had he been manipulating me all along, or had I manipulated him? At this point, I wasn't even sure I knew the difference. As I drove to my mother's house, where I'd been staying since Graham bought out my share of our home, I tried to imagine what came next. Court-mandated therapy, supervised visits with my own daughter, the humiliation of everyone in town knowing exactly why my marriage had failed. But the most devastating realization was yet to come. That evening, as I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the remnants of my adult life, I finally understood what everyone had been trying to tell me for months. I had called my husband Replaceable at our anniversary party, in front of our friends and family and our 8-year-old daughter. I had emotionally cheated on him for months while complaining about his shortcomings to anyone who would listen. I had refused to take responsibility for any of it, instead blaming him for being too sensitive and everyone else for overreacting. And in the end, I had been the replaceable one. Graham had built a new life without me, surrounded by people who respected and supported him. Chloe was thriving in his care, away from the toxic environment I'd created. Even Ethan, who I'd thought was my closest confidant, had chosen to distance himself from the chaos I'd brought into his life. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone to call, someone who might offer comfort or validation. But most of our mutual friends had chosen sides, and they hadn't chosen mine. The few who remained seemed uncomfortable with my version of events, as if they could see through my justifications to the truth I still couldn't quite face. Finally, I put the phone down and stared at my reflection in the bedroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, bitter, isolated, and completely alone. This was what I had gained by insisting I'd done nothing wrong. Absolutely nothing. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that everyone else had been right and I had been wrong. The thought was terrifying, because it meant acknowledging that I had destroyed my own life through my own choices. But maybe, just maybe, it was also the first step toward building something better from the ruins. My phone buzzed one final time with a message from an unknown number. "This is Chloe's new phone. Dad says I can text you sometimes if I want to. I miss you, Mom, but I'm glad it's quieter now." I stared at the message until tears blurred my vision. My 8-year-old daughter was relieved that her home was peaceful without me in it. That single sentence contained more truth about my behavior than months of legal proceedings and family arguments. I had been the problem all along, and now, sitting alone in my mother's house with nothing left to lose, I finally had to face that truth. The next morning, I called the therapist the court had recommended and scheduled my first appointment. It wasn't because I wanted to change. I still wasn't sure I was capable of that level of honesty. But for the first time in months, I was willing to consider the possibility that I needed to try. Because losing everything had taught me one final devastating lesson. Some jokes aren't funny, some behavior can't be justified, and some damage can't be undone. But maybe, if I was very lucky and worked very hard, some relationships could eventually be rebuilt, starting with the one I had with myself,